All right, so again, class Tuesday, the notes on the 16th failed to record. So this is attempt number 2, or maybe 3, who's to know, of me recording these notes for you. So we will be covering absolutism or alternatives to absolutism in Europe in this one. We will also be talking briefly about why it failed in England, it being absolutism. I would also like to continue on through Oliver Cromwell's Puritan Protectorate today, and I will likely record another set of these notes to finish out the chapter later because you guessed it, today, Thursday the 18th, my camera did not work again in class. So it'll give me a chance to brush a few things up. It's going to be just fine. To start notes off, alternatives to absolutism in the European kingdoms. The 17th century was a time of absolutist growth in many European kingdoms. Military spending would reach an all-time high following the modernization of Europe's newest powerhouse, France. While this time saw the growth of many autocratic powers throughout Europe, there were other types of governments forming in the wake of the Protestant Reformation as well. The tumult that brought on these societal changes, these political revolutions, can be directly tied back to the Protestant Reformation in many cases. However, the first one that we will mention, constitutionalism, was one of the results of the social unrest in the lower classes. In this form of government, government is limited by the rule of law. Now, what form that law comes under, as far as what the document is called, changes with different kingdoms. Laws that are recorded, laws that are enforced by the will of the people, these laws protect named rights and liberties frequently. So, we'll see that come into play shortly. Republicanism would be a second form of non-absolutist government that came to be practiced at this time in a couple of the European kingdoms. Republicanism is one of the early forms of constitutional government. This form of government does not recognize a monarch, but rather a government that is formed of elected officials. Now, that term of elected official, who could be elected, what it took to become an elected official, that would change again with which kingdom that we're talking about in European history. But in general, it's the beginning of elected officials. The Dutch Republic will become one of the best examples of this form of early government. This new form of government would coincide with the Dutch Republic's golden age. So again, you see the laws changing, the ways of government changing, at the same time that you see economic growth. Now, does one spur the other, or are they related at all? We shall see. Other kingdoms develop modified versions, things like constitutional monarchies, where the monarchy is still present, becomes more of a figurehead because they're bound by a legal system and they're more directly answerable to the people. So, the first of these, kingdoms to practice this, we'll talk about a few different times throughout our notes coming up. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Good title for your notes. Europe's first constitutional government. Poland and Lithuania had established a common monarchy through marriage around 1368, when the crown of the Kingdom of Poland married into the Duchy of Lithuania. The ruling arrangement with the peoples of both kingdoms became official in 1569 with the Union of Lublin. Now, that would be a response to Russia's growing power and desire to control a deepwater port, but we'll get to that later on. But for now, those two royal houses, the House of Poland and the House that controlled Lithuania, those two governments, they became controlled by one government. So, with that document, again, the Union of Lublin in 1569, the monarchy would face strict checks and balances in front of a noble-dominated parliament. So, again, you had to be a noble to sit on the parliament, but the monarch himself was regulated by, a gathering of peers, if you prefer the term. Another key feature of the Union of Lublin, that document, was the necessity of Parliament electing their monarch. So again, it's not no longer a hereditary post as it had been and still remained in some of the other kingdoms around Europe. Holy Roman Empire soon followed suit in this idea, create a parliament that elects the monarch. However, the parliament continued, in the case of the Holy Roman Empire, to simply elect a Habsburg, member of the House of Habsburg, very powerful in Austria. So, the Commonwealth. Ooh, jumped ahead of my notes. I apologize. Nope, we're good. The Commonwealth became known as a wealthy and religiously tolerant kingdom. It's attracted artists, philosophers, a vast array of other people who fled intolerance throughout other kingdoms in Europe. And thus, the Commonwealth was also known for becoming the home of a large number of Jews and Muslims and Orthodox Christians, be they Greek, Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox. The Armenians were very big in a global trade network sense. They had established many small trading outposts throughout a lot of kingdoms. And as Orthodox Christians, they were frequently persecuted, but through that persecution, small outposts of them would remain, and those outposts all around the world, especially around Europe, many of the new colonies, those would eventually turn into a very, very powerful trade network. So, get to that in a little bit. Militarily, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was able to expand its borders to Moscow in the early 1600s for about 2 years, 1610 to 1612. It made the wise decision to rely on its ethnic and religious diversity to keep them neutral during the 30 Years' War. So, while the rest of Europe was, killing off the local populations during the conflicts that resulted in the 30 Years' War, during all of that, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with all of its vast, different religions, different practices in it, decided to remain more or less neutral in the 30 Years' War. Good decision. While the rest of Europe suffered huge losses to the rural population, Poland and Lithuania were largely untouched. As Russia became more militarily aggressive under 17th century czars especially, the Polish Commonwealth, as it became again mid-century at that point, was reduced in size and political stability that had allowed for its growth in the first place. So, kind of an ending to that section. Let's go ahead and talk about the failure of absolutism in England. So, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth formed as a result of not wanting to have an absolutist monarch with singular control. Absolutism would not hold on in England very long either. To that point, England refused to continue on the absolutist trajectory established by other early 17th century monarchs throughout Europe. From the years of 1603 to 1640, two of the kings who followed the beloved Elizabeth I, James I, and his son Charles I, both favored and showed a proclivity towards unbridled control, kind of like Louis XIV exercised in France. Now, when James I came to power, it was not many years before there was an early attempt made on his life in 1605. This was known as the Gunpowder Plot, in which a group of radical Catholics attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament and kill the king. This was, of course, because James was a Protestant. So, Protestant versus Catholic, still part of the whole 30 Years' War issue following the Reformation. So the idea for these radical Catholics, they thought, if we blow up the king, who's Protestant, we could come in and ostensibly, as the Catholic nobles, reinstate a Catholic king. Well, this didn't go according to plan, because on the 5th of November, England still celebrates Guy Fawkes Day to this day, meaning that James was not blown up, but the idea behind overthrowing an overly powerful government still plays a, heavy hand in some celebrations to this day. However, to explain the Gunpowder Plot, if any of you have ever seen the movie V for Vendetta, the main character in it is a visage of Guy Fawkes. And Guy Fawkes was one of the Catholic conspirators who decided to try and blow up the king, right? Now, on the 5th of November, he was discovered with some compatriots loading gunpowder into the lower levels of the royal, I think it was the Houses of Parliament, if memory serves. And before he could set off the bomb, he was captured, tortured and hanged for his trouble. So Guy Fawkes was not a successful revolutionary. Interesting character in history. Certainly not the only person involved in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Very interesting topic to do some research on. I encourage you to. Either way, back to the notes. From roughly 1603 to 1640, the two kings never called Parliament to meet. Now, this was, of course, the way that nobles got together to check the power of the king. Now, James and Charles, respectively, knew that if they did not allow Parliament to meet, then, problem solved. They didn't have to answer to Parliament. Problem with that, this allowed them to act as absolutist, and many groups underneath the, parliamentarian system and members of the Anglican Church began to splinter off. They didn't really care for the crown at this point. Calvinist Puritans declared that both Calvinists who were becoming Puritans declared that the Protestant and Catholic faiths were in need of purification, hence their name, Puritans. James I did not care for this stance and married a French Catholic woman just to say, aha. He also began to allow the Archbishop of Canterbury to exercise a lot of control in the kingdom again. And this displeased many, many people who had just gotten back to a sense of, religious and political stability in England. Cromwell had done a number on England. And, the nobles were not ready to give that up again just yet. So, we'll get there. James I eventually gave way to Charles I. Charles was not very popular either. He was unable to raise money for an army to protect his northern border, and this is after many years of, again, trying to be too authoritarian and not calling Parliament, just like his father had done. But when finally Charles realizes he needs his military, who, again, have to be paid for, to fight back attacks of Scottish rebels, Scottish religious fanatics on the northern border. They wouldn't say fanatics. They would see themselves as perfectly normal, but the English would have seen them as religious fanatics. And likewise, the Irish Catholic forces started showing kind of an interest in expanding into some of the areas that England had taken for itself. To raise the money, Charles agreed to let Parliament meet. He also agreed to sign what was called the Triennial Act. The Triennial Act. Now, this guaranteed the right of Parliament to meet every 3 years. So whether the king called them or not, Parliament had the legal right to meet every 3 years. Very important step forward in combating what was becoming quickly England's march towards absolutism. So, can't have that. 1641, Charles again had failed to raise that army. But he had a civil war to fight because Parliament had raised an army, and they had called this army that they funded themselves the New Model Army. So Charles is kind of on the ropes here, right? You got to raise an army, you got to fight back against these people who used to support you. And as king, you still had the power to raise some. I mean, some of the nobles didn't turn their back on Charles and supported him militarily. However, the New Model Army was raised to fight the Scots and the Irish, but this army would also lead to an overthrow of the monarchy because the New Model Army answered to a guy by the name of Oliver Cromwell. Now, Cromwell, and what would be known in 1649 as the Rump Parliament, charged Charles with, among other things, decapitatable crimes, meaning that they wanted to chop his head off. And guess what? Oliver Cromwell and the courts at be found Charles guilty. Now, that's in a nutshell. I don't want to underplay the military battles such as Naseby and Langsport in 1645. There was a general back and forth going on for a little while. However, the English Civil War resulted in the New Model Army, who again fought for Oliver Cromwell and Parliament, resulted in them overpowering the forces of Charles. So, now that someone who is, I guess if you want to look at it this way, elected by Parliament, is now in control of the military. And the military answers to him, not to Parliament. Now, this is going to be a problem when you don't have a king, but you need a singular figure to represent your government, right? So Cromwell, again, kind of steps in and fills that position. Excuse me while I turn notes one more time. So, in your notes, I would title this section The Puritan Protectorate, or Cromwell's England if you prefer. This was an odd time for England. England prides itself still to this day on continuing that hereditary line all the way back to, I think, Alphabert or Ethelbert was his name, perhaps, one of the very earliest kings of, what would become England. So that lineage matters. This is a weird time in Cromwell's England under the Puritan Protectorate because there is no monarch on the throne. Right? The Commonwealth, the English Commonwealth as it was at this point, was ruled by a noble-led parliament on behalf of the people, if not by outright election. But the government answered to the army, right? The army that parliament had formed. But it was controlled by the, originally, we'll call him somewhat religiously tolerant, Oliver Cromwell. Now, Cromwell led for a few years, and then in 1649, his less tolerant side came out. And he decided to fight back against this Catholic invasion. And in that, he got a religious fervor about him that he decided he was going to start retaking a lot of Catholic lands that had been occupied by Catholics in England and throughout Scotland and part of Ireland, too. So, when he took it from the Catholics, he made himself very popular with some English and Scottish Protestant landlords. He just transferred power. By 1660, so, 11 years after this, that had resulted in 2 years of Oliver Cromwell's son coming to the position of leadership. You can't call it the throne or the crown, but Parliament was ready after these 2 short years of Cromwell's son and his terrible policies for a monarchy again. However, with Charles II and the restoration that began thereafter of the Anglican Church, the nobles wanted stability, right? We've talked about this time and time again. Nature, government too, abhors a vacuum. So a power vacuum is still a vacuum, and they needed to fill this vacuum. In this case, they brought in Charles II. This led to the overthrow of, James II, who was Charles II's son, by the Protestant cousin Mary and her husband William of the Dutch Republic. Now, we'll get to that in just a second, but the restoration happens. Parliament decides, we don't like Cromwell's son. They ask Charles II to come back and fill in where his decapitated father had left off. Now, he was limited much more by the actions of Parliament, the Anglican Church as well. His son, James II, then comes to the throne and is not quite as pro-Protestant. So in the mindset that the nobles had at the time, they could not afford to go back and fight another civil war. Didn't want it. So instead of dealing with James II and his potential conversion of the country back to Catholicism, they instead asked Mary, who is James's cousin from back up the line a little bit. She had married into the House of Orange, the ruling family in the Dutch Republic. So William of Orange and Mary are asked by the English Parliament to come back across and take James's place. James II, that is. This is called the Bloodless Revolution. I will go on the record here and say it was not bloodless. It led to a Protestant retake of the throne, forced James to France. He raised an army there, was not going to stay quiet forever. Started the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland. Again, another bloody period of social unrest. However, in 1689, Parliament established in England the Bill of Rights, and that separated the judiciary, judges, from the crown. It legitimized William and Mary as the desired rulers. They were co-crowned, King and Queen of England. It also, again, stabilized that England would be an Anglican nation, or an Anglican people, not Catholic. This eventually led to what was called the Act of Great Britain in 1707, that, again, formalized a lot of these ideas and agreements. And, that is still in effect today, 330 odd years later, some odd years later. So, The Act of Great Britain led, and again, just this political mindset that was going around at the time, led thinkers of conceiving of like a constitutional monarchy in different ways. How to avoid government oversteps with a system of checks and balances. The ruled had the right to resist, according to some popular thinkers of the time, like John Locke. If the consent of the governed is not, if the governed no longer consent to be ruled by an intolerant government or by a dictator, then it is the right of the people to rise up against, the ruler that they don't care for. If you're a king or a monarch, that might not be the most popular stance to take and talk about at court, but John Locke got heard. Either way, to the next section, the Dutch Republic. We mentioned it in importance in passing with William of Orange coming to England in the Restoration period. And William took a big step up in his title, because when he was in his homeland, the Netherlands, he headed an oligarchy of rich estate leaders. So again, in France, you had the Estates General or Estates Generale. In the Dutch Republic, you also have, the estates, the levels of society and certain members within it. These estates ruled the republic and held the power of the vote. So again, in a republic, they elected their leader. It wasn't a king, he was an elected official. This ethic led to kind of a wealthy and stable kingdom. Again, you elect your ruler in, that means by choice of the people, at the very least a few people on top, that they are put in power and can have power taken away from them potentially. And that power dynamic typically encouraged rulers to, rule on behalf of their people a bit more. Doesn't always work, but sometimes it worked. And we're going to get more to the Dutch Republic in just a moment. But right now, in your notes, you may want to break apart another section that is titled Colonial Expansion and Empire. So this is really the notes that we covered today, Thursday, in class. Again, I'm speeding through fairly quickly with no discussion points. But as far as, just an easy way to get the notes from class, not a bad way here. So today, Thursday, the 18th, this starts from this point forward in the video, starts our notes from today. There you go. Colonial Expansion and Empire. Good section for your notes. Remember, England, France, and the Netherlands, Dutch Republic, would all follow the example set by the colonial movements of the Iberian powers of Spain and Portugal. The idea of building countries in far abroad destinations had allowed for Spain to grow to control a large portion of the world's silver. Again, discovered silver in one of their colonies, made Spain fabulously wealthy. Also led to their general decline as a powerhouse in Europe because they over-invested in their own silver, thought that the mines would never dry up. They did. The Dutch also were notorious pirates for Spanish silver. We'll talk more about that soon. However, the idea of building colonies in faraway places was appealing. Other European nations, minus Russia, began to compete for the creation of these colonies to increase what would be called a mercantile or mercantilist stance. So, a brief aside on mercantilism, as it's one of your vocab terms. The theory of a mercantile economy or mercantilism exists in kind of a pyramid shape. You have the control of raw goods and silver, gold, spices, etc. They change over time, but raw materials, rubber would be another one in the future of where we are in history now, but rubber would become a very important, tradable good soon. So with the control of trade in a mercantile economy, it's everybody has a little bit until they lose a little bit, and then someone else has taken that bit from them until someone else takes that person's little bit, and eventually you wind up with, a pyramid going up towards the top of control of raw materials and goods. One kingdom to take control of the majority of trade. That was the idea, be the most powerful one out there, control the most trade. So with that, colonies are invaluable. You need raw materials from places that are not your, home kingdom, so to speak. In these movements, England would move as far as North America. We're all still here. You would have France go up in the Great Lakes area and New France, what is now Canada. They would explore all the way down the Mississippi River to as far as modern day, I think Arkansas would be fair to call it. Had a couple of very famous explorers at that time. You had the Dutch establishing colonies as far away as Asia and the southern tip of Africa in Cape Town, what would eventually become South Africa. So, again, these major powerhouses we're talking about here are all big on expansion, creating colonies to extend their reach towards gaining a higher position in this mercantile world that existed at the time. So, in an effort to control that, the Dutch trading empire had a particularly vicious worldview. We'll talk about it more in a few moments, but beyond not concerning themselves with, like following any moral or ethics kind of, code on how to treat people, as far as like when they're taking over their countries to control their raw materials, the Dutch have a long history of being very, very brutal. Again, mercantilism often takes a military track when we're talking about this point in history. The Dutch Republic and the estates leaders, artisans, there was a general level of just trade and wealth going on in the Dutch Republic in the early 1600s, early 17th century. This wealth had grown from early fishing corporations, the development of superior naval fleets. We spoke briefly again in class. I've read an account of the Pilgrim's trip from England to on the Mayflower to what we now know as the United States, what would become the colonies first. And it is horrifying, y'all. Like freezing cold conditions, rain dripping through all of the boards, generally just a horror show of travel. Well, the Dutch, which again, about the same time, had put a lot more study into the creation of better ships and better naval forces, in no small part because, they saw the value in traveling by the sea. So, in 1599, one such voyage made a successful trip to Southeast Asia and returned with a load of spices and goods that made investors of this voyage incredibly wealthy. 100% return. Just a short 3 years later, and one of the most divisive businesses in history was ever formed. This was the Dutch East India Company. Had a great question in class. Why is India in the name of the Dutch company here? I'm still going to have to do some research on that, and I will answer. But Mr. Yovera and I theorize that it's because India was a central point in all of these trading networks. So that's an active theory until I am proved otherwise, or I do some more studying myself. Either way, let's continue. In 1602, the spice trade had opened up great potential for any Dutch person that was able to invest in the spice trade at this point. Now, the reason that you were looking for investors and the reason that these trading companies formed is because sailing, while big business, especially in the Dutch Republic at this point, was also a very expensive business. Not only did you have to buy the goods that were eventually going to be traded, you also had to pay the crew. You also had to outfit the crew. You also had to, there were numerous things that had to be invested in before the ships that were going to bring you your money back could even set sail. So, again, not only big business and a huge lifestyle in the Dutch Republic that revolved around, naval trades and sea life, but to get back to the point, these voyages were attempts, the voyages that were thus funded, were attempts to find a way around the Portuguese dominance of the world spice trade, especially in the Asian markets. Now, this was accomplished when the Dutch merchants began to trade with and assist the indigenous peoples of some of the Portuguese colonies. So again, Portugal had been there, and Indonesia, as we're about to discuss, and had established colonial holdings there, and had been fairly oppressive of many of the local peoples, the local Indonesians. So when the Dutch come along and offer to, give a little military assistance to some of these locals, you could understand why the Dutch would become very popular. And when Portugal or the Portuguese ports were eventually taken over by the Dutch, and these colonies became Dutch colonies, you could see why it would be such a letdown to the locals that helped the Dutch get there, that the Dutch would turn out to be crueler colonial powers, colonial leaders rather, than the Portuguese had been. So Indonesia, like I said, was the first on the list of these colonies. While the Portuguese were disliked by the indigenous people, the Dutch came to be hated. The Dutch West India Company was begun in 1621 to compete with the other European pushes into North and South America. So, again, you had England founding Jamestown and allowing for the foundation of Plymouth later on. You had the Great Lakes region in Canada being taken by France. Well, to compete with that, the Dutch created the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch also, again at the same time, relatively speaking, established Cape Town in what is now South Africa. And these trading posts, and one throughout the Caribbean, allowed the Dutch to become the leaders in the world slave trade about the 1640s. So, again, ports in Africa, around the Caribbean, where a lot of the slaves were used, made them very, very wealthy. England would eventually take over, but we'll get there. Get to the right page again. So, to briefly touch on the colonial empires of England and France, England tried first in North Carolina, or as we know it as North Carolina today, with the colony of Roanoke. A lot of conspiracies exist around why this doomed colony was, forced out of existence, whether it was a local plague, pandemic that pushed the colony apart and killed everybody, or forced them to wander away from the original colony and be lost to history, or if it was an attack by some indigenous peoples. Conspiracies abound. However, in 1607, Jamestown would be established. And this colony began trade in American tobacco, a few of the other goods that would be grown here, but tobacco being especially popular. The rice and sugar that were typically from the Caribbean islands were, the products that made the Caribbean islands the most valuable of any of these colonial holdings. So, as the need for sugar increased with the founding of these colonies, sadly, the need for slaves to work the sugar plantations increased with it. Now, the Dutch had already established ports in South Africa again to facilitate the gathering of slaves from Africa. They also had ports in the Caribbean where, other plantation owners, other, governments would purchase slaves to work on their sugar plantations on the Caribbean islands. So, very brutal time. Plymouth, however, another one of the English settlements to be established, came around for different reasons. It wasn't quite as mercantile in nature. It was a little bit more Puritan in nature. And these were, Protestants that were seeking religious tolerance. I think we're all pretty familiar with the story of why the Pilgrims came over here, right, on the Mayflower. But they wanted, freedom to practice their own religion, and to do that, they needed to be able to support themselves once they got to this side of the Atlantic. Now, as the different areas that were the colonies or would become colonies evolved, they all came over with a central religious idea. That was their guiding light. This idea would split off into many different ideas within, a couple of generations of the original Jamestown colony. So you go from having one colony with one idea to having multiple colonies that have multiple ideas of religion and society and self. So you can see how, while they are all united, still under the English crown, the control of James, you still have independence, in a sense, forming between the different, colonies at that point. So it's no surprise that they became independent states later on. As I mentioned, France started to dominate the northern part of North America, the Great Lakes region especially. And with that, they started taking over the fur trade. Now, I say taking over because Russia would take it from them later down in the line, later in the notes as it is. But these French, pioneers of the fur trade there, as we've talked about before, brought those good old European diseases in and really did a number on the local population. So, yay, all the good stuff, right? Now, get back on track here. Mercantilism and colonial wars, another section for your notes. Each kingdom would enact their mercantilist views in different ways. These would come as taxes and embargoes in home countries, and in some cases, guild and trade regulations, right? French finance minister under Louis XIV, Minister Colbert, instituted very strict monitors over French goods. So, quality control, if you will. Quality was encouraged and sales went up. Make a better product and people will buy it. Sales created the need for more artisans to make these quality goods to sell. And this led to the creation of some of the early French trading guilds. So again, demand goes up. People are needed to make the product that is in demand. The people then find the education to become skilled at making that product. And it's a cycle that we'll see throughout the rest of this chapter and several others. But it discouraged people from importing goods into France. So, again, big difference there. Oliver Cromwell's Navigation Act of 1651 would fall into this general, milieu of results of mercantilism. Enforced a trade standard where only British sailors could bring goods in from abroad, or it would tax the foreign sailors to pay the difference. This increased prices for goods coming from non-British lands into England. It also decreased the power of the Dutch in that same way. So, whereas the trade had been dominated in the Atlantic by Dutch powers, legal changes at home in England, again spawning from 1651, dictated that to get those goods at a reasonable price in England, they needed to be brought in by British people on British ships and handled by British people on the shore. Again, to pay all of the taxes to import something from the Dutch would be just impossible. It would be way too expensive when you could get it done, as the government approved way. So what it did was, really did a number on how much the Dutch, especially, if not, the French and Spanish too, controlled the seas. So again, very important stuff. England began to gain the upper hand in the Atlantic trade, even as after the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, freed France from its colonies in the north and the Spanish of their colonies in the south. So again, War of Spanish Succession, the Peace of Utrecht, both very big turning points, focus points in this section. The War of Spanish Succession, again, would devastate France's colonial power and lead to their fall from supremacy to England. England would also grow to control the majority, again, of the African slave trade following the Peace of Utrecht, and this allowed them to exercise even more control over the other countries. So again, if you want to import slaves, you now go through England. With the new kingdoms came new maps, borders that defined areas of control. However, borders are rarely made with the consent of the people that they affect, right? Two groups that were especially swayed by the autonomy that colonialism offered, mixed with the social mobility of the groups who operate well within the limits of the economic standards of mercantilism, were, of course, again, Jews and Christian Armenians I mentioned earlier. Both of these groups, through their, persecution, being forced to many different places, had established strong trade networks throughout the world. All right, so this brings us to our last section on the notes, which is good, the Russian Empire. Now, one of your main questions on your discussion topic revolves around how Russian absolutism is different than, English, French, Spanish absolutism. So pay a special attention in this, if you please. All right. Russia grew out of the waning powers of China, Mongol empires. Religion and politics, from both kind of influenced what would become now known as Russian. Okay. Now, this area that would become Russia started off as a province of, or as a vassal state, if you prefer, of a Mongol empire, the Mongol Empire, the Kievan Rus area. Now, it's in bold in your book. Please find it if you need to. This area was, part of Russia and some of the modern day satellites. And for generations, the Mongol leaders, the Mongol kings, the Khans, showed great favor to the dukes of an area called Moscow, or what was called Moscow at the time. Now, generations later, in 1480, Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, was strong enough as a ruler to declare independence from the Mongols and created a kingdom of Muscovy that expanded, well beyond the provinces that were originally under his control, went all the way to the Ural Mountains and even beyond. So again, if you look at your map in your book, very large swath of land becoming what is, under the control of one person very quickly. With the support of his nobles, or they were called boyars, Boyars, Ivan declared Moscow an autonomous kingdom that he ruled with many of, again, the same features of the Mongol kingdoms and rulers. After 1453, the dukes of Moscow had taken on a kind of a religious mantle, okay? So the Byzantine Empire was the last vestige of the Roman Empire, like Julius Caesar, Roman Empire. It had moved into the Black Sea area that was now surrounded by what was called the Ottoman Empire. The one holdout of the Byzantine or Roman Empire was in Constantinople. 1453, the Ottomans take Constantinople. From that point on, so about 30 years until we get to Ivan III, the Dukes of Moscow started viewing themselves as the protectors of Orthodox Christianity. So gave them a very strong tie to religion and state being tightly close again. Let me pick back up in the right place. Ivan declared Moscow an autonomous kingdom, ruled with many of the same features of the Mongol rulers. Ivan III instituted sweeping reforms to his growing kingdom. He carried over the Mongol ideas of taxation, using conquered peoples as taxable and workable slaves, postal routes, and in fact a census as well. All of these tools aided in establishing a strong support network for the Russian ruler to be an autocrat. So again, if you know what everyone's doing because you've taken a census, you can tax them more effectively. You know how many people there are to tax in the first place. Numerous good things come out of paperwork. Borrowing from the word Caesar, again, out of the Byzantine vocabulary, the Russian czars would come to fill a unique position in the history of autocrats in modern times. Czars answered, theoretically, only to God, given that they occupied that very religious spot of protector of Orthodox Christianity, besides being a political figure. This elevated status was far above most other European rulers at the time. And while the term Tsar was not used until Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, named himself King of all of Russia in 1547, the title is a direct take, again, from the Roman word Caesar. And like the Roman Caesars, Tsars would continue to grow their power after the reestablishment of the position after the Polish-Lithuanian takeover in 1610 and 1612. So you have a gap there where it went Tsar, no Tsar, foreign leader, and then Tsar again. But either way, by increasing the size of his army, Ivan did a lot of things. He was successful in his own right, but Ivan IV was not known for being kind of like a forward-thinking in ways of society kind of guy, right? He had the boyars that made fun of him as a child. I think his father died when he was 3, his mother when he was 7. So he spent the first 16 odd years of his life being made fun of at various points a lot by his nobles. Well, when he crowned himself Tsar at the age of 16, he was still a 16-year-old kid who was bent on some revenge. In that, he decided to kill a lot of the boyars, their families, friends, and pretty much anyone that displeased him in his youth. At this time, he, of course, alienated many of the nobles that he had left alive by killing their friends and the other powerful people in Russia that were underneath the Tsar. And those that remained, those boyars that remained, and a lot of peasants actually rose up against Ivan IV when they joined forces with a very horse-driven society, very pastoral, nomadic culture known as the Cossacks that had existed for centuries on the edges of the Russian lands in the steppe. So With that, rebellion, Ivan would, put down the rebellion, and in some of the reforms that followed that, he did some things like tying serfs to the land that they lived on, effectively making them a slave workforce. Peasants soon, similarly, were, taxed and tied to their job and their location. By increasing the size of his army, Ivan was able to add to the size of his empire at the expense of, Mongol lands. This fertile landmass became the breadbasket of Russia, and he came to control all the way to, Ural Mountains to the Volga River. Pretty big swath of land, again. This expansion, or mindset to expand, would cost Ivan. He decided he wanted some, cold water ports or some deep water ports, and decided to go to war with Sweden and Poland, Lithuania in attempts to get them. His desire, his war, spawned the 1569 Union of Lublin, formally uniting the houses of Poland and Lithuania, as we talked about earlier in class. And following Ivan's death, it would be the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that would take over Moscow from 1610 to 1612, until some remaining, Russian nobles decided to elect their next leader. So, who would they choose to lead them? Michael Romanov. This was a cousin of Ivan's wife, I want to say, so still maintaining the bloodline for hereditary purposes. But from Michael Romanov, we get the last name of the czars that ruled all the way up until Russia lost all monarchy. So his family would rule until 1917, 1918. The Romanov line continued to grow their power and autonomy by reforming laws to allow for the aristocracy to hold mastery over the masses. So they allowed aristocrats to exercise great control over the masses, and then the czars under the Romanov line were very strictly controlling the nobles. So, strict levels of control, but serfdom, again, under the Romanov line would be established even stronger, it would be even more firmly established into the Russian way. So we'll get there. We're almost done. We will, however, talk about now Peter the Great and his turn to the West, because that is, again, where we're going to end the chapter. Peter came to power in Russia via the Romanov line as a young ruler. Peter used Ivan IV's premise for a lifelong noble-run civil service to, again, expand his power. Ivan had set up even if you were a noble, you had to work in the civil service or the military. Peter the Great liked that idea and worked with it. He wanted to expand his empire. Peter did, from the Atlantic all the way to the Baltic. And that was going to take a better military than he had. And, to do this, he had a great idea. That I will tell you about as soon as I finish finding the right place. So, in 1696, Peter had completed his first goal. He had beaten back the Ottomans sufficiently to gain access to the Black Sea. In 1697, he'd been in power for about 15 years, Peter took a tour of the other kingdoms of Europe, and he went with the idea of modernizing or westernizing Russia. So he came back with hundreds of mathematicians, scientists, people that he wanted to establish schools throughout Russia, which he did. He also came back with military experts to revamp his military. So again, this was in an effort to westernize, modernize Russia. For 21 years, Peter the Great had to fight the Swedes for control of land and naval power. Again, he had beaten the Ottomans, gotten his first goal. The Great Northern War, as it would become known fighting Sweden, gave Peter many reasons to improve military strength and civil service. That's why he wanted to, again, he took a tour and wanted to modernize, to westernize. However, while he did believe in modernizing in that way, peasants and serfs were still very much, not treated well. And under his rule, the iron-fisted nature of the aristocratic government tightened even more on serfs and peasants. Peter also sought to limit the power of his nobles, common goal. He did this, as had Louis XIV at Versailles, by establishing a ritual of court etiquette. This etiquette meant that men and women of different powerful families, different noble families, all met and, partied together, with Peter controlling the interactions a little bit. But again, it decentralized the power that any one noble family could really, exercise. The downside of Peter is this modernization cost him about 80 to 85% of his kingdom's wealth, which is not sustainable. Why he is called the Great is a matter for history, because at the time his nobles did not like the modernizing that he was pushing onto them, and the serfs did not benefit either. So, again, we will get to, I guess, the next chapter in our next class. Thank y'all very much.